Beth Cochran. Today is February 24th, 2009, and I'm conducting an interview with Peter Lassally for the Archive of American Television in Los Angeles, California. So Peter, we're going to start with some easy questions. First, what was your name at birth?
Wow.
I told you, easy.
Come on. Actually, my name at birth was Peter Eduard Gerhard Lassally.
Okay. And when were you born?
October 14, 1932.
And where?
Hamburg, Germany.
And can you tell us, what was your father's name and what did he do?
Paul Lassally, and he was in the coffee import-export business.
Okay, and how about your mother? What was her name and what did she do?
Elsa, and she didn't do anything.
And did you have any siblings?
Sister Irene, 4.5 years older.
Okay. And can you talk a little bit about how your family was affected during the outbreak of World War II?
Well, we left Germany in the end of 1938 and moved to Holland to get away from the Nazis, except we didn't go far enough. We were supposed to go to England from Holland, and we didn't get out in time. You could try and get yourself on some fishing boat and smuggle yourself out during the night, but we didn't succeed at that. So we lived in Holland, and the Germans followed us there in 1943.
Mm-hmm. And what was your experience following that? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. In 1943, the Germans invaded Holland. We went to concentration camp. My father died just before we went to the concentration camp. And from 43 to 45, first a concentration camp in Holland called Westerbork, and then a concentration camp in Czechoslovakia called Theresienstadt, or Terezin, as it's also known, and got out in 45 and went back to Holland.
How would you say that those experiences shaped who you are today?
Oh, many ways. It certainly interrupted my education. It makes you grow up rather than be a child. So I missed at least 2 years of my childhood. So you just become mature and living under stressful, scared situations. So it does affect you. And part of the problem, which you will find out during the interview, is I learned to block out all the ugly things I was dealing with during the war. And I still have that problem to this day. I automatically block things out. So you will find there will be questions that I go, gee, I don't know how to answer that.
That's okay. When did your family come to the United States?
I came here in 47 with my mother and my sister. My mother had a brother living in Canton, New York.
And how old were you at that time?
I was 15. And he was the college physician at St. Lawrence University in Canton, and I lived with them for a short period of time, while my mother and sister went to New York to try and settle into a new life. and I'm going to put a period at the end of that.
Did you know English?
No, I didn't. I learned English living in Canton, which can be dangerous because the other kids in school will teach you things that are not supposed to be spoken. So curse words and provocative statements were taught to me, which I innocently repeated, and to great enjoyment by the others.
What activities were you interested in at that time? And were you listening to radio programs?
Yes, I was always, no one in my family was in show business, but there was always, we came from a successful, wait just a moment please, I'm going to start that over. We lived in a house filled with music, classical music, chamber music. Recitals would be held in our house. And as early as, I think I started to get violin lessons at age 5. From a rather famous violinist, and was a child prodigy and gave recitals at a very early age. But I also loved popular music, and again at age 5 was conducting jazz bands that I listened to on the radio. So I was always very much into music. So it looked like a show business might be my goal, but probably more in music rather than radio or television at that stage.
So when you went to college, you went to Dartmouth?
I did not go to Dartmouth.
Oh, you did not. I'm sorry. You went to St. Lawrence. I'm sorry.
Right.
And when you were there, were you thinking about show business at that point?
No, all I thought about was learning English at that time. But I was watching late night talk shows as long as I can remember. And it was in my blood. So both radio and television were really what I was concentrating on.
So what was your first job then?
My first job was, my first job was as an usher at Radio City Music Hall, which was very prestigious. It was like getting into West Point, you know. You'd line up and be with white gloves and uniforms, and there would be a lineup, and they'd inspect your shoes, and it was just like being in the Army. But there was one other low-level job, even more prestigious than that, and that was being a page at NBC. And I managed to get that next. And at that time, which was 1951, there was the big switch from radio to television, and there was nobody who had television experience, so it was easy, or easier, to get into television, because they would pick people either from radio or from theater, because television was just starting. So being a page in that era, you could get a starting job, low-level job, as a production assistant or something, and work your way up rather quickly, as opposed to now.
Yes. So now, what was the first job that you did then, getting into television?
The first job actually was on the outside, not at NBC. I got a job as an assistant to a woman who had a radio show on WOR, and her name was Ruby Mercer. And one of the things that was part of the show was opening night reviews of Broadway plays. And that really was my first job, doing reviews for plays. And that led to producing her show. And then I got a job at NBC, again radio, a show called Monitor, which was a weekend 48-hour radio program, which a radio program on NBC called Monitor, which was a new revolutionary format of starting Friday night and going until late Sunday night. And there I started as a, again, production assistant kind of job. One of the problems with the job was I had to type the rundowns for the show, and I didn't know how to type. And I found girls on different floors at NBC in the RCA building, and I would hand them each one sheet to type and hand them out, and then have to collect them an hour later. And it was a race every day when they said, well, I didn't have time to do it yet, and I'd say, I have a deadline, you have to do it right now. So that was a scary part of the job, getting the rundowns typed. But I managed to succeed doing that. And from there, the next job was producer of a radio show called Nightline, before the current Nightline, which was a 2-hour nightly radio show on the NBC radio network. And that, again, was a completely loose format. It was a magazine-type format. It was partly news, partly music, partly comedy. And that's where I found and started people like Mort Saul and Nicholson May and Shelley Berman, who would do little 5-minute vignettes. And that's where I really started what I love doing more than anything else, and that is finding talent and developing them.
How did you come to work on the Arthur Godfrey programs?
Arthur Godfrey, who at that time was the biggest star in radio and television, and really a legend. I got that job from a producer who left Godfrey and came to me and said, hey, are you interested? And I said, yeah. And I started on the Godfrey radio show, and then also did television, and became president of his production company. But I can't tell you how big a star he was. He was huge. And at one point, actually was going to run for president of the United States. Remember the movie Face in the Crowd? That was based on Arthur Godfrey.
Oh, okay.
He was just, I can't even, you know, Oprah is the closest thing I can think of. You know, he was just, everybody knew Arthur Godfrey. So I worked for him for 2 or 3 years. And the advice that I was given by the guy who was his producer was, Arthur loves the people that he hires and is crazy about them and madly in love with them, but sooner or later he turns on you. So he said, my advice to you is, at some point he will ask you to go to his ranch in Virginia for the weekend with him. And my advice to you is, don't go, because it's just the beginning of the end. And I followed that advice. But sooner or later, Arthur turned on me too.
Do you feel that you learned a lot of the foundation of what you had?
Yes, I learned a lot from Godfrey, because Godfrey, one of his secrets to his success was that he, before anyone else, in those days, people on radio had announcer voices and spoke in stentorial tones. And Arthur was in the hospital having a lung removed and listened to radio and realized that there was a different way to do radio. And that was to speak to one person at home in a very casual, friendly, cozy way. And I learned that from Godfrey and have used that to this day with people like Craig Ferguson, and say, talk to one person at home, don't address the studio audience, talk to that person at home, casual, one-on-one basis. And I learned that from Godfrey, and it's very effective. It makes a huge difference.
You talked about, that you loved finding talent, and at that point, was there a process for you for doing that? How would you go about finding talent?
One of the qualities I have that get me through show business is I respect talent. I'm in awe of talent. And if you are really talented, I will put up with your craziness. Because if you're that talented, you're not a normal person. There's something wacky about you. And it helped me through 50 years, at least 50 years of show business, in that I was willing to put up with craziness if I respected you. And I've worked for some great broadcasters, starting with Godfrey, and then Johnny Carson, and then David Letterman, and then Tom Snyder, who are really great at what they do. And now I was lucky to find Craig Ferguson, who is also uniquely talented. So
let's talk a little bit about Johnny Carson, who you just mentioned. How did you first come to meet him?
It was through his wife number 2, who, unbeknownst to him, was very much involved in the hiring and firing of people on his show. And she had heard about me from my days at the Godfrey show, and had heard that I was wonderful at whatever it is I do. And she wanted to get a television show of her own, and was wondering if I could produce a pilot with her. So I did get together with her. The pilot never sold, but Johnny wanted to fire his producer, whom she had quietly planted there before by herself, without us realizing it, and wanted me to replace that producer. So I was hired as associate producer of the Carson Show, with the knowledge that that was just temporary until they fired the producer, and then I would take over for him. And that didn't quite play out the way it was written, because then she met, at a party in Hollywood, met Freddie DeCordova, who was Jack Benny's producer and director, and Jack Benny was Johnny's idol. So Johnny thought, gee, is there any way we can get Freddie DeCordova to produce the show? So he and I produced it together. And I worked my way up from producer to executive producer, along with Freddie. And I was there 23 years.
How did you and
Which
Fred...
is rare, as you know, in this business.
How did you and Fred split duties then, since you were running the show together?
Well, we both had a sign on our desk. One said, Freddie handles that, which I had on my desk, and he had a sign that said, Peter handles that. So we managed to do it that way. Freddie was great at being charming, funny, big personality, and I liked behind the scenes and getting things done my way. And that worked out great. He was the meet and greet guy, and he was a charming man. So I let him have all the attention he would like, and as long as I could get things done my way. So it was great. We worked beautifully together.
In working with Johnny Carson, how would you describe him, working with him, versus personally, knowing him on a personal basis?
It's interesting you would ask that, because when I worked for Johnny, we would see each other socially maybe 2, 3, 4 times a year at functions or parties. But I never felt that we were friends, nor did I want to be friends. Again, carry over from the Godfrey days. Don't become friends, just keep a business relationship. But after Johnny retired, we became very close friends. And he was a completely different guy. Johnny was always, when he was working, shy, reserved, introverted guy. After he retired, he became a much warmer, relaxed, really a different guy. So that's when we had our close friendship, until the day he died.
And so, I mean, Johnny being, the Johnny that we all know, coming out on stage every night, we would not think of him as someone who is
Johnny
that
was
way.
as shy a person as you'll ever meet. Wife number 3 made the mistake of wanting to be very active socially and would drag Johnny to these parties in Hollywood, and he hated every moment of it, and would sit in a corner and just not talk to anybody because he just wasn't comfortable. And I think that was one of the problems that why that marriage didn't last, because he couldn't stand all this social activity. It just made him miserable.
But when he was out on stage, what do you think it was? What did you see in him, in his talent, that when he got out there, he was so different?
Well, I can tell you a very scary experience I had. I think it was the first week of my working for Johnny. And after the show, he asked me to come up to his office. And we had drinks. And he got drunk, which he could do very quickly and easily. And he started to pour his heart out that he didn't deserve the job he had, and that he wasn't worthy. And it was really disturbing to me, because he showed all his insecurities and poured them out. And I thought, wow, this is going to be a rough trip. But that was the only time in all those years where he just lost control completely and revealed what his fears were. But when he had too many drinks, he could get out of control rather quickly.
What do you think was the secret to the success, as far as you having such a long relationship with him on The Tonight Show?
He was really unusual in the fact that for being a big television star, he didn't live in his own private little world. By that I mean he was well read. We would discuss politics every day. We would discuss books, magazines. He was completely well-rounded. It wasn't all show business for him. And I think that was one of his rare talents, in that he was not living in his own little show business world. Arthur Godfrey, for example, we did a TV special in India, and he was interviewing Nehru. And during the interview, Nehru said, well, when Gandhi died, the following things happened. And Arthur said, Gandhi dead? He had no idea that a world personality had died, because he lived completely in his own little Arthur Godfrey world. Johnny was the opposite of that. And I think he had a great sense of humor. He was a good listener. And again had quality like Godfrey in that he could be as far as the viewer was concerned, it could be their boyfriend, it could be their father. He was every man. So women liked him, men liked him. He just wasn't a threat to anyone, and that's a very important quality.
Can you describe a little bit your day-to-day responsibilities as far as the production went?
It's always hard to answer what a producer does. You're in charge of everything. Uh, it's always amazing to me that so much of your day is spent on personnel issues, and you shouldn't have to. By that I mean people not getting along with each other, or people feeling other people are being treated better than they are, or whatever it is. It's a lot of your day is wasted on keeping people happy and productive. But you're responsible for the content of the show. You're responsible for finding new ways to do the show. And you have to be good at working with talent. But my favorite, as I mentioned, my favorite part is finding new guests or new singers or new performers or comics. And that always gave me the biggest pleasure of all, to find someone, and then they became giant stars, and you thought, isn't that nice? I found these people.
Can you give us an example from the television show?
It could be Barbra Streisand. You know, she was a girl that hadn't done any television. No one had seen her. And she used to live right above. Well, I also produced, after, if I can just go back in my resume, after I left NBC in '61, I produced the first syndicated television talk show, called PM East for Westinghouse Broadcasting. That was hosted by Mike Wallace. And it was during that period where I found Barbra Streisand, who was hanging out in an apartment right above our studio. And I talked with her. She was a real character. So I put her on as a guest. That was before I knew that she was a singer. She was just a real New Yorkie character, girl had about a dozen keys, which were apartments that she could sleep in for one night or 2 nights. She didn't have a place of her own. And then the second time she was on, I had her perform, and she sang like a bird. So we used her on a regular basis, and she then got a Broadway play from that, and a great career, as we all know. And Bette Midler, who was singing in a bathhouse in New York, and someone mentioned it to me, and we brought her in for an audition. And again, a great, unique talent, also crazy and insecure. And even, after her 20th appearance, was still completely panicked every time she showed up. Never found any security whatsoever. But remarkable talent. So people, or comedians, whether it's Gary Shandling or Bill Maher, these are people I saw either in a club. Gary Shandling I actually saw on the Merv Griffin show. That I put on the show. There are many comics. Stephen Wright I found in Boston when I was looking for colleges for our kids. I had them bring in all the comics in Boston to this restaurant to do. There were about 20 stand-ups that night, and the last one was Stephen Wright. My kids wanted. It was really late. They wanted to go home and couldn't stay awake, and I said, I got to stay till the end. And the last one was Stephen Wright. And when we walked out of the restaurant, called the Ding Ho Chinese restaurant, all the comics were out in the parking lot to find out how they did. The only one that wasn't there was Stephen Wright, because he was strange. And I had to find him in the phone book and call him the next day. But I love finding people that are really, really talented.
What do you think that you see in those people when you were watching Stephen Wright, or when you saw
Well, when I saw Stephen Wright, I said, this is completely different from any other comic ever. It was unique, different style of comedy. And you get, or I get, very excited when I find something that's unique, that's just better than anyone else you've ever seen. And I love having the opportunity to build them by using them. I mean, Stephen Wright was a smash the first time he came on the show. So I brought him back a week later, and another week later. You know, you can. The Carson show was a great place to discover and build new talent, and it's thrilling. I mean, Stephen Wright, every year on the anniversary of his appearance, calls me and thanks me, you know, for the last 20 years. Because he's just a sweet, decent guy. But it's so nice that you can give somebody a whole career just because they haven't had the exposure.
Were there people that Johnny saw that you agreed or you disagreed with as far as talent?
No, actually, Johnny and I had similar tastes. He was very uncomfortable with comedians who played a character, such as, help me on this, who am I thinking of, Katie?
Comedians who played a character?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going blank always on names, but I'll get it in a minute. I'll give you clues. He's dead. Andy Kaufman is one, who played a character but refused to step outside of the character. Mm-hmm. That made Johnny crazy. You know, who does he think I am? That's an act. But they're pretending like that's who they are. So he wasn't happy with that type of comic.
Joaquin Phoenix last week.
Well, Joaquin Phoenix would be the perfect example, right, last week. And look, you know, how they did a takeoff on the Oscars. He had a real problem with that. Anyone who would put on a pretentious act and not willing to, even during the commercial break, to step outside of that character.
Could you tell when you were in the booth that this is not going well here, or?
Oh, well, the one time with Johnny when things weren't going well, where he lost it, was with one of Charlie's Angels. Not the original three, but one of the replacements, and I won't mention the name, where the interview was just terrible because she was not very smart. And Johnny actually lost it and said, have you ever read a book? And the studio audience roared because they realized it wasn't going well. And that's the only time I can remember where on the air he just had to say, this is terrible. Most of the time he would, when he did an interview, he would do everything he could to make the guest look good, which again was one of his talents. He was not looking for the laugh himself. He was really all the time trying to make the guest look good. But on that one, he just gave up. I've lost my train of thought. What was your question?
Well, I actually wanted to know also, in doing postmortems with Johnny, what was your input, and how much input did you give him, and how much did he want?
Johnny was very good. We would always spend, after the show, at least 15, 20 minutes unwinding and talking about the show. And I sometimes had the tendency to be much more negative than he was about a portion of the show. And he would say to, I mean, it was reversal of roles. He would say to me, oh, it'll play much better on the air, you know, don't worry about it, which is not the way it's supposed to be. I'm supposed to calm him down. But I've always had a good relationship with the hosts I've worked with, in that I would tell them the truth, whether they liked it or not. And that has really worked well for me. That's how I got the title of Host Whisperer, in that I'm not good at pumping sunshine up their ears. If I didn't like it, I can't fake it. I can't pretend it was good. But I've been very lucky that hosts have respected that in me and were willing to put up with that. Except, actually, I remembered one time when Burt Reynolds was hosting, I was much too honest with him, and he couldn't tell me. He just fell apart. So you have to be careful. With Craig, for example, with Craig Ferguson, I learned that it's best not to tell him the truth that night after the show, because he's still on a high. But I tell him the next morning. I give him my notes and said, this didn't quite work and this didn't quite work, and then he can handle it much better.
So how much input did you have on The Tonight Show and through these other shows with guests, booking guests? Obviously there's someone that books
Complete
guests. But
control. It was always very important to me that we booked guests for the right reasons. My reason was, are they a good guest or a bad guest? Most talk shows book guests based on their being in the #1 movie or the #1 record, whether they're good guests or not. I never believed in that. To me, the question was, are they likable? Are they good guests? And I will watch my television viewing is basically watching talk shows and interview shows to protect myself from the bookers talking me into booking somebody who's really a terrible guest. And again, I've been lucky in that I've worked on shows where we didn't have to book the #1 hot, popular thing. I did it to my standards. And it worked for me.
So what do you consider a good guest? And are you looking at the chemistry you think will be
But
there?
the chemistry is important, but likability is important. If you have some young little Fox network sitcom actress who hasn't had any experience in life, because she's 18 years old, chances are I won't book that guest because they don't have anything to say. The last thing you want is some dopey little kid telling you about the world situation as she sees it. Nobody wants to hear that. So likability is number one. Do you like that person? And you can tell, really, in the first 30 to 60 seconds, whether you're going to accept that person, or whether they are completely fake, or whether they have an attitude. And all of those things I take into consideration. Does that person have something interesting to say? Do you care about that person? Or are they off-putting? And I'm very fussy about that.
And can you talk a little bit about sexual tension between a host and a guest?
Well, the first time I really paid a lot of attention to that was when Burt Reynolds guest hosted for the first time. We had become friends when he guested. And at that time, he was actually #1 box office star in movies. So when I booked him to guest host for the first time, I said to him, let's try and figure out what guests we should book on your first show. Mind you, on the Carson show, we had guest hosts every week. So you can die with a guest host because they have never done it before and they don't know how hard it is. It's really, really hard. And there are many people that I booked as guest hosts that were panicked once the red light came on. Either movie stars or television stars, you just assumed that they had enough of a personality to carry themselves for an hour. But as opposed to Saturday Night Live, where the guest host is in a written sketch, here they have to be themselves and lead the interviews. So one of the problems when you're booking guests for a guest host is they want to book all their friends. And that surely gives them a comfort level, but it becomes very inside. It's all of a sudden the two people talking and the viewers are really left out in the cold. So yes, to some degree, you give them one person maybe that they can feel secure with, but you generally discourage booking friends. But at that time, Burt was newly divorced from Judy Carn, who was one of the stars on Laugh-In. And I said, what's your relationship like with her? Are you friends, or was this all? And he said, no, we're still friends. And I said, you know what, I'd love to bring her on as a guest. And at the end of the show, I want everyone in the audience to feel like the two of you might get back together again. And he said, yeah, I can do that. And it worked great. And the studio audience wouldn't leave even when the show was over because there was such electricity between the two and so much flirtation that everyone really thought, oh my God, they're going to get back together. Well, I couldn't have been more thrilled because that's what I was aiming for. So ever since then, I love to try and find people where there is sexual tension between the host and the guest, because you just watch it with your mouth open. Wow, these two really like each other. And we've done it many times with Craig Ferguson because women really fall in love with him and sometimes flirt outrageously with him. And sometimes it gets him involved, and it makes for very good television.
So talking about guest hosts, I want to talk a little bit about Joan Rivers. And
Right.
How did she come to be a permanent guest host on The Tonight Show?
By default, I had it down to Joan Rivers and Gary Shandling were the two permanent guest hosts, and they split the number of shows between them. Gary, who's very talented, got It's Gary Shandling show, his own TV show, and decided that he couldn't do both. And his manager at the time, Brad Gray, agreed with me that Gary was crazy to give up the guest host spot because it kept him on television, and he could easily do both. There was no reason that he couldn't do both. And Gary came to the point where he said, no, I can't do both. I got to concentrate on my own TV show. So I lost Gary and begged him not to do that. So that gave Joan the full sole host, guest host. And what I tried to do with Joan, my family and Joan's family became friends, and I told her that if she was to become the only guest host, she had to try and change her material. I was sick and tired of all the same sex jokes. And she said she would do that. She could do that. Because Joan's a very intelligent woman. It's just her material is the lower level than I would have liked. So I said the only way that I would give her the whole thing was if she would raise the level of the comedy she was doing. Well, she never did. Then she did another thing that wasn't nice, which is when she got the Fox show, she assumed, because we had been friends, that I would quit Johnny and produce that show, which she had never discussed with me. As a matter of fact, we were in negotiations to renew her contract with The Tonight Show. And she called me the night before her press conference announcing the Fox show to say, could I meet with Barry Diller? Whatever salary I wanted, he would pay for it. But I had to be at that press conference announcing. And I said, I have no intention of either being at the press conference or having a meeting with Barry Diller, I wanted to stay with Johnny until the end. And that got very ugly. And and she said terrible lies about me, that of course I was going to produce her show, which was never, ever discussed. So that was an ugly split, and I haven't booked her on any shows that I've produced.
And there was fallout between her and Johnny as well, because Johnny felt...
Well, Johnny, number one, believed that I had made some promise to Joan, and was of the impression that I was disloyal to him, until he found out by doing some research that none of that was true. But it was a terrible bunch of lies that I just want nothing to do with her.
Understood. Now, let's talk a little bit about when Johnny decided to retire. And did he come to you with that decision?
Well, Johnny, there were several years, I guess about 5 years, where he said, this is the last year. I don't want to stay too long at the fair. And he said, you need to tell me when you think the time has come, because I may not see it. So the last few years were, well, maybe I'll stay one more. And there was a time where I really thought, I think it was when he was 60, I can't remember now what the age was, but I thought that either 60 or 65 was the right time to go, and he stayed 1 or 2 years beyond that. But he was still great at what he was doing, and he didn't stay too long at the fair. The funny thing was, Jack Benny, who I said was his idol, Jack Benny did stay too long at the fair and appeared in clubs or concert halls much beyond the time he should have left. And I kept pointing that out to Johnny, that, we didn't want that to happen to him. Bob Hope was another one that stayed too long. And again, we would discuss he shouldn't make that mistake. So we had examples of major stars who we felt stayed much too long.
So when he decided to retire, how did you feel about that, as far as your own career and what you would do
As far as
next?
my own career, I was very friendly with David Letterman. We were close friends because I started him again on The Tonight Show. And Dave always wanted me to quit and come with him. And I always said, no, not till Johnny quits. So I knew that when Johnny quit, that I could produce the Letterman show, and did. I took 1 week off after Johnny quit, and then started with Dave as exec producer 1 week later. So I didn't really ever think about what the next step would be for me. I've been unbelievably lucky that I went from one show to another.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break.
Okay.
Thank you.